A major reversal from President Donald Trump. He is ordering House Republicans to approve the full release of the Epstein investigative files, a move senior officials say was triggered by immediate political risk assessments late last night.
Sources inside the White House confirm advisors warned Trump that blocking the bill could intensify scrutiny and escalate the fallout ahead of today's forced vote. Within minutes, Trump publicly shifted, declaring Republicans should back the release and stating, "We have nothing to hide."
Okay, hold on. Let's be clear. After months of calling the Epstein documents push a Democrat hoax, after telling his party to block it, stall it, bury it, and pretend it didn't exist, Donald Trump suddenly wakes up at 3 in the morning, grabs his phone, and blasts out an urgent demand that Republicans must vote to release the Epstein files because we have nothing to hide. Really? Now you have nothing to hide. Okay, hold on. Nobody pulls a 3 a.m. political U-turn unless something inside the machine is overheating. And right now, the machine around Trump is basically throwing sparks. Because here's the part they don't want you to notice. This vote wasn't triggered by Trump. It wasn't even triggered by House leadership. It was forced, literally forced, by a bipartisan group using a discharge petition. And if you don't follow Congress closely, let me translate that. A discharge petition is what lawmakers use when leadership refuses to schedule a vote because they know the result might explode in their face. So, what happens? Lawmakers go around them. They bypass the speaker, bypass the committees, bypass the entire power structure, and drop a bill straight onto the floor. And they only need one thing: 218 signatures. Guess what number they hit this week? Yeah, exactly. And here's where it gets even wilder. This wasn't 218 Democrats. This wasn't 218 anti-Trump voices. This was a coalition that included Republicans, real Republicans, who decided that shielding Epstein's documents was a political grenade they were no longer willing to hold for Trump. Imagine the panic that triggers at the White House. Imagine the phone calls. Imagine the advisors saying, "Sir, this is happening with or without you." And suddenly Trump does the one thing he hates more than anything else. He follows the momentum instead of controlling it.
And you know what else should set off alarms? The timing. If Trump wanted to look strong, he would have announced this in the middle of the day, surrounded by allies, acting like it was his idea all along. But he didn't. He made the announcement in the middle of the night. That is not the action of someone in control. That is the action of someone who just learned something or just got told something that changed the political equation instantly. And yeah, this is wild, but stay with me because this part matters. Trump didn't just reverse himself. He reversed the entire narrative he built for months. He went from Democrat hoax to release everything in one sentence. That's not messaging, that's shock. That's scramble mode. That's someone trying to get in front of a story they no longer have a grip on. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. While Trump is trying to look like he's suddenly pro-transparency, the actual engine behind this vote, the bipartisan rebellion inside the House, is already moving without him, which means Trump isn't leading this moment, he's chasing it. And when Trump starts chasing a story instead of shaping it, you know something big is coming next. And yes, what comes next is exactly where this gets even more unbelievable. And here's where everything gets even more interesting, because once you actually zoom in, you start realizing this wasn't some random 3 a.m. epiphany from Trump. This wasn't him suddenly waking up and thinking, transparency is good, the public deserves the truth. No, this was political triage. This was damage containment. This was a White House that finally understood it was about to lose control of a story that's been simmering for years, one they absolutely did not want to boil over, especially right now, with the House preparing to take a vote that Trump never expected to get anywhere near the floor. So let's walk through what actually set this off, because this wasn't just a vote being scheduled. This was a vote being forced. There's a difference. When the speaker puts something on the calendar, that's leadership saying, "We own this." When 218 members bypass leadership and force it, that's the House saying, "We own this now." That distinction matters because it tells you something very simple. Trump's influence wasn't enough to stop the momentum. Not this time, not on this issue. And for someone whose entire political identity is built on absolute control, command of the base, command of the narrative, command of the party, losing control of any piece of the machine signals vulnerability. And vulnerabilities attract pressure. here's the part people miss. When the House hit that 218 signature threshold, they did it with Republicans who would normally never break ranks. These aren't moderates. These aren't anti-Trump holdouts. These are people who've stood with Trump on issue after issue, scandal after scandal, even when it meant torching their credibility. So when they suddenly decide, out of nowhere, that Epstein transparency is the hill they're willing to climb, maybe even die on, something changed. Something triggered them. Something shifted the internal political calculus, and that shift, whatever it is exactly what caused Trump to react at 3 a.m. instead of 3 p.m. Let's be honest, Trump doesn't do anything quietly. He doesn't do anything that looks like he's following someone else's lead. So for him to reverse himself in a panic window with no staged rollout, no talking points, no coordinated messaging with the party, that means the ground moved faster than he did. And when Trump is behind the story instead of in front of it, you're looking at an administration that's bracing for impact.
But that's not even the most revealing part, because the moment Trump reversed himself, suddenly Speaker Mike Johnson, who had been slow-walking, stonewalling, and outright blocking this bill, changed his tune overnight. Suddenly he's saying nothing to hide. Suddenly he's claiming he always wanted transparency. And if you're wondering whether that kind of synchronized narrative flip is coincidence, it's not. It's the political equivalent of a fire alarm going off inside the building. When leadership that was resisting a vote suddenly starts acting like they supported it all along, they're not leading. They're clearing space. Something bigger is driving them. And, okay, here's the part they really hope you're not paying attention to. There's pressure coming from two directions at once. First, bipartisan pressure in Congress. The signatures didn't lie. Once this hit 218, the House basically announced, "This is happening now, try to stop us." Second, public pressure is spiking in a way it hasn't in years. Epstein survivors, advocacy groups, and transparency organizations have been pushing relentlessly, releasing videos, organizing campaigns, and even projecting Trump-Epstein imagery onto the Department of Justice building with the message, "Release the files now." And while Trump loves to ignore outside pressure, he hates when stories stick. And this one is starting to stick in a way he didn't anticipate. But here's the twist. This wasn't just Democrats making noise. A portion of conservatives, including some who've defended Trump at every turn, started arguing that full transparency is necessary to clear Trump's name. And let's be honest, that's the tell. When your own allies start framing transparency as a way to save you, it means the fear isn't about truth, it's about perception. It means the political cost of blocking the files suddenly looks worse than the political cost of releasing them. You don't flip at 3 a.m. unless that cost-benefit equation has changed dramatically.
Let's talk about the discharge petition again, because it's still being wildly underestimated. A discharge petition is the legislative equivalent of staging an intervention. It's numbers saying, we don't trust leadership to handle this responsibly, so we're taking control. And in this case, it wasn't just aimed at Mike Johnson. It was aimed at Trump, too. The petition wasn't just a procedural move. It was a message. Your influence isn't enough this time. And that message is exactly what Trump reacted to. Think about it. He could have stood firm and opposed the vote. He could have doubled down. He's done it 1,000 times before. But instead, he scrambled to align himself with a vote he didn't initiate, didn't want, and couldn't stop. That's not strength. That's survival instinct. That's someone trying to reposition themselves before the floor drops out. And here's where it gets even messier. Reports indicate that some of Trump's most loyal allies were furious about the reversal. They weren't prepared for it. They weren't briefed. They weren't told to change their messaging. Imagine being a loyalist who just spent weeks calling this bill a Democratic trap, and then overnight, you're expected to pretend you never said any of it. That kind of scramble creates cracks, internal cracks, the kind that widen fast if you're not careful. Trump knows that. He knows a fractured GOP is a dangerous GOP. He knows that fractured messaging leads to fractured support. So flipping early, even at 3 a.m., was his way of trying to prevent the narrative from fracturing around him. But the irony is that the very act of flipping is what exposed the fracture in the first place.
And it gets worse for him because by flipping, Trump unintentionally validated the entire case for transparency. He proved the point his critics have been making for years. If the files shouldn't be released, why the sudden panic when they finally are? Why the rush to get ahead of a vote he couldn't stop? Why the change in tone? Why the urgency? Those questions hit harder than any partisan talking point, and Trump knows it. But the real danger for Trump, the one nobody's talking about yet, is what happens if the House vote passes overwhelmingly, because that's where the story stops being about Trump's reversal and starts being about Trump's vulnerability. And trust me, that's where this gets even more unpredictable. And the second this becomes about vulnerability instead of strategy, everything shifts, because once you acknowledge that Trump didn't willingly decide to lead this moment but was dragged into it, you start asking the real question: why was he dragged in? And that's the part they absolutely do not want front and center, because if the political system around Trump is suddenly willing to force transparency on an issue he's avoided, minimized, or mocked for years, then that means confidence inside the GOP isn't where he wants you to believe it is.
Trump's entire political brand depends on presenting himself as unstoppable, the guy who bends institutions to his will, not the guy who gets caught trying to keep up. So when members of his own party decide they're no longer willing to take the hit for him on the Epstein Files, that's not just a policy disagreement. That's a signal. It tells you there's a growing belief inside the Republican Party that shielding Trump on this particular issue has become more dangerous than exposing him. And look, Republicans don't break ranks unless the calculation shifts dramatically in one direction. So what shifted? What new information or pressure is circulating behind closed doors? This is where things start to get uncomfortable for the people who spent months insisting there's no story here. Because if the GOP truly believed there was nothing damaging in the files, they would have released them years ago. They would have done it when Trump was president the first time. They would have done it when Bill Barr ran the DOJ. They would have done it when the Senate was fully in Republican control. They didn't. Instead, they blocked transparency at every turn, and not quietly. They did it aggressively, repeatedly, and with the level of institutional muscle you only see when there's fear behind the scenes. So when those same people suddenly decide to force transparency now, right as Trump's campaign is trying to solidify power, right as the House is fracturing, right as the DOJ is under pressure, that's not a coincidence. That's timing. That's survival instinct. And yes, that's panic. You don't stick your neck out for years and then suddenly flip unless you're worried that the fallout for remaining loyal is about to outweigh the fallout for letting the truth out.
Okay, hold on. Here's the part that really matters. And yeah, this is wild. Look how fast the messaging changed. One day it's Democrat hoax. The next day it's total transparency. That's not a normal pivot. That's a controlled demolition of a narrative that was becoming unsustainable. And if you followed Trump long enough, you recognize the play. When he senses a story slipping away, he doesn't gradually adjust. He nukes the previous position and pretends it never existed. It's the "I never said that" strategy. It's the "this was my idea the whole time" strategy. It's the political equivalent of wiping the whiteboard and hoping nobody remembers what was written 5 minutes ago. But this time, people do remember, because the contradiction is too blatant. Trump spent months arguing the Epstein Files push was a politically motivated trap. He claimed Democrats were using it to smear him, to distract from their failures, to rewrite history. And suddenly, when a bipartisan group forces the vote and he realizes he can't stop it, he declares he's always supported releasing the files. You can't have it both ways. Either the bill was a hoax, which he no longer claims, or transparency is the right thing, which he now insists. When both statements come from the same person within days, even hours, the contradiction exposes something deeper. The politics changed faster than he could keep up. And if the politics changed, something triggered that change. Maybe it was internal polling. Maybe it was pressure from donors. Maybe it was new information about what's in the files. Maybe it was the realization that opposing a bipartisan vote this large would look like an admission of guilt, or at the very least, an admission of fear. But whatever it was strong enough to make Trump reverse himself instantly.
There's also something else happening that isn't getting enough attention. The Republican Party is quietly recalibrating. Not publicly,
not loudly, but you can see the signs if you look for them. Lawmakers who've stood with Trump on every issue except this one. Staffers who are whispering to reporters that leadership felt cornered. The sudden push from some conservatives claiming transparency will clear Trump. These aren't random data points. They're pieces of a political pattern. When a party believes a story is going to come out anyway, they try to get ahead of it and spin it as favorably as possible. But that strategy only works if you move early. And the GOP did not move early. They moved when they were forced. And Trump moved even later than they did. That's why this moment feels different. Normally, Trump dictates the pace and the party follows. Now, the party is sprinting ahead of him and he is trying to catch up. That reversal of momentum is subtle, but critical. It means the old dynamic, Trump leads, Republicans obey, has a major crack in it. And let's address the elephant in the room, the survivors. The pressure from Epstein's victims has been constant, unwavering, and morally undeniable. Their voices are shaping public perception in ways Trump can't counter, because no matter how much he tries to paint this as a Democrat plot, the movement behind the transparency push is diverse, bipartisan, and deeply personal for the people involved. You can't smear survivors. You can ignore them temporarily, but when the public starts listening, really listening, your political defenses collapse fast.
And that's exactly what happened here. The survivor pressure was building. The bipartisan pressure was building. The institutional pressure was building. And suddenly, Trump found himself in a position he never expected, boxed in on all sides. That's why the reversal was so sharp. That's why it was so late. That's why it was so desperate. But here's where all of this hits another level. Because once the House vote happens, and if it passes overwhelmingly, the focus shifts immediately to the Senate. And the Senate is not the House. It's slower, it's colder, it's more cautious, and its members are significantly more sensitive to public backlash. They know the optics, they know the stakes. They know that blocking the release after a massive bipartisan vote in the House would look like a deliberate stonewall. And nobody wants to be the senator on camera explaining why Epstein Files should stay hidden. Which means Trump is now dealing with a political machine that's slipping out of his hands at the exact moment he needs it the most. He's running a chaotic campaign. Legal battles are piling up. And the last thing he needed was a transparency fight he can't control. But the real shock, the moment that turns this from a political reversal into a genuine crisis, is what happens if the documents reveal anything that contradicts Trump's public narrative, even if it's something small. Even if it's something ambiguous, because once the files are public, the story becomes a free-for-all. Reporters dig, lawmakers dig, opponents dig, and Trump no longer gets to frame the narrative with one Truth Social post. He loses control permanently. And there's one more twist coming, the one that's going to define the entire next phase of this story. And when you see it, you realize why the panic hit at 3 a.m.
And here's where the entire situation takes a turn that nobody in Trump's orbit wanted to think about, let alone confront. Because once those files move toward release, once bipartisan momentum becomes impossible to stop, the next question writes itself. What if the story that emerges isn't the one Trump has been selling? And that question alone explains every panicked move we've seen up until now. Because Trump isn't afraid of transparency in principle. He's afraid of losing narrative control in practice. And that's the one thing he cannot afford right now, not with an election cycle breathing down his neck and every institution he once relied on starting to fracture under the weight of political reality. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Trump has always operated under the assumption that narrative equals power. The moment he defines the story, he wins. The moment someone else defines it, he fights like hell to take it back. But this time, he can't dictate it. He can't stall it. He can't bury it under legal delays or procedural tricks. Once Congress forces the release, the story becomes uncontainable. It spills into the public domain, driven not by his allies, but by transparency groups, investigators, journalists, people who don't answer to him. And when Trump realizes that, you get these kinds of 3 a.m. reversals. They're not strategic, they're defensive.
But there's something deeper happening beneath the panic. Something that's been building for years.
The Epstein case has always been a political earthquake waiting for the right moment to erupt. And for a long time, Trump believed he could ride out the tremors by dismissing them as partisan attacks. But the fact that this vote is moving things to Republicans, not Democrats, changes everything. Because now the pressure isn't coming from the outside. It's coming from inside his own political infrastructure. And internal pressure is always 10 times more dangerous than external pressure. Republicans know how to read the room. They've seen the polling, they've watched the grassroots. They know that shielding Epstein files has become a political liability. They know that transparency plays well across party lines. But more importantly, they know their own careers are on the line. And when self-preservation kicks in, loyalty evaporates. That's what Trump didn't see coming. He was so used to being the center of gravity that he didn't recognize the moment the gravitational pull shifted away from him and toward the political consequences of secrecy. And let's be real. When you have Republicans publicly saying the files should be released to clear Trump, that's not a defense. That's an admission that the stench around this story has grown too strong to ignore. They're not protecting him. They're protecting themselves from appearing complicit. It's the political version of saying, if he has nothing to hide, then let's find out. That's not loyalty. That's exit strategy wrapped in supportive language.
And here's where the most explosive dynamic emerges. Trump's power has always depended on the perception that Republicans will pay a price if they cross him. But now you're watching Republicans cross him on something he explicitly told them to kill, and they're doing it without fear. That should terrify Trump more than any investigation ever could. Because once your allies stop fearing you, your influence collapses faster than you can rebuild it. The most telling moment in all of this wasn't Trump's reversal. It was the reaction inside the party after he reversed. Some Republicans acted relieved. Some scrambled to rewrite their talking points. Some pretended they never opposed the files in the first place. But mixed into that chaos were Republicans who were visibly irritated that Trump undercut their position with zero warning. And irritation inside a caucus is not just a mood, it's a trajectory. Irritation becomes resentment, resentment becomes independence, independence becomes defections. And in politics, defections spread. What's even more astonishing is how much this entire story undermines the myth Trump has spent years building, that he controls the party with absolute authority. Because if you're watching closely, you can see the cracks forming, not because of ideology, not because of policy, but because of survival. When your party starts choosing self-preservation over protecting you, the power dynamic collapses. And that's exactly what's happening here.
But here's the real twist, the part that's going to define the next phase of the story. The moment those files become public, the media doesn't need Trump's permission to frame the narrative anymore. They don't need his talking points, they don't need his spin. They'll report on the contents directly. And even if the files don't contain anything explosive about him, the very fact that he tried to keep them sealed for so long creates an optical problem he cannot undo. Because once the public sees that transparency only happened after he was cornered, they start asking the question he hates most. What were you afraid of? And then the conversation shifts from what's in the files to why did you fight so hard to hide them? That's a political death trap, because there is no winning answer. If he says he fought it because Democrats were weaponizing the issue, he looks paranoid. If he says he fought it because of privacy concerns, he looks evasive. If he pretends he never opposed it, the receipts prove otherwise. And if he admits he flipped because the vote was inevitable, he looks weak. Every answer leads to loss. That's why the 3 a.m. panic matters so much. It's not just the timing, it's the tell. And this is where things get truly unpredictable. Because right now the political world is bracing for impact without knowing where the debris is going to land. Senators are preparing statements, reporters are digging for angles, activists are organizing, the DOJ is being pressured from all sides, and Trump is trying to calm a storm he did not create and cannot control. That's the worst possible position for him. He thrives when he sets the tempo. But right now, Congress is setting the tempo, and Trump is trying to dance to a rhythm he never expected.
And the strangest part is that the people inside Trump's orbit aren't speaking with confidence. They're speaking with anxiety. Anonymous aides are giving vague quotes about wanting transparency, which is Washington speak for, we're trying to spin something we didn't plan for. When messaging becomes reactive instead of assertive, you know an operation is struggling. And believe me, this operation is struggling. But here's the final piece of this spiral, the part that will determine how massive this becomes. What happens when the Senate is forced to choose between shielding Trump and protecting themselves? Because that choice is coming, whether they like it or not. And when it arrives, Trump is going to learn, maybe for the first time, that fear isn't permanent, power isn't permanent, and loyalty in politics evaporates the second it becomes inconvenient. That's why this story isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. And the next move, not Trump's, but the Senate's, will decide just how explosive this gets.